The ship was dead in the water. Not drifting. Not damaged from battle. Just silent. Deep inside the steel belly of the naval vessel, alarms had gone quiet, not because the problem was fixed, but because there was nothing left to try. The engine room smelled of hot metal and failure. Dozens of experts had already been through here. Engineers with decades of experience. Contractors flown in at absurd cost. Whiteboards full of equations. Tablets full of diagnostics. None of it mattered. The engine, a complex, classified system, refused to come back online. A senior engineer finally said the words no one wanted to hear. It can't be repaired at sea. That sentence traveled fast. Up the chain of command. Across secure lines. Straight to the Admiral. On the bridge, the Admiral stood staring out at open water. Calm face. Tight jaw. This ship wasn't just steel and fuel, it was a symbol. And right now, it was helpless. "How long to tow?" he asked. "At least 3 days, sir. If weather holds." 3 days exposed. 3 days vulnerable. 3 days of headlines if anyone found out. The Admiral didn't respond immediately. Instead, he asked a different question. "Who trained the people who designed this engine?" Silence. Then, quietly, someone answered. "An old Navy program, sir. Decommissioned years ago." The Admiral nodded once. "Find me one of them." They hesitated. "Sir, most of those veterans are retired. Some were pushed out. Others never got recognition." "I didn't ask about recognition," the Admiral said. "I asked if they're alive." Hours later, a helicopter landed on the deck. No ceremony. No announcement. A single man stepped out. Older. Calm. Wearing a plain jacket, no visible rank. Some of the engineers glanced at him, then away. He didn't look like the answer to a billion-dollar problem. The Admiral met him personally. "You're the one who worked on the prototype engines," the Admiral said. "Yes, sir. They tell me it can't be fixed." The man didn't argue. Didn't defend himself. He just asked one question. "May I see it?" Down in the engine room, the veteran moved slowly. Not because he was unsure, but because he was listening. He placed a hand on the casing. Closed his eyes. Felt the vibration that shouldn't have been there. The room stayed silent. Then he spoke. "You shut it down wrong." One of the engineers scoffed before he could stop himself. "We followed protocol." The veteran turned, finally looking at them. "You followed the manual," he said evenly. "We wrote the manual to be safe, not smart." The Admiral watched closely. The veteran pointed to a section of the engine no one had touched. "Your fault isolation skipped this chamber because the sensor reads nominal." "That sensor has never failed," an engineer replied. The veteran nodded. "Exactly." He explained it in simple terms. No equations. No ego. Just cause and effect. "The engine isn't broken," he said. "It's protecting itself from a condition you don't know how to trigger manually." The room shifted. Tools were handed over. Panels opened. Steps reversed, carefully, deliberately, against everything the experts had insisted was impossible. The Admiral checked his watch. 20 minutes later, the engine hummed. Not loud. Not dramatic. Alive. Power flowed back through the ship like a pulse returning to a heart. No cheers. Just stunned silence. The Admiral finally spoke. "Why wasn't this in the documentation?" The veteran wiped his hands. "Because back then," he said, "they didn't think anyone like me would ever be the one fixing it." And in that moment, everyone in the room understood. This wasn't just a repair. This was a reckoning. Long before the engine failed. Long before experts gave up. There was a young sailor no one expected much from. He didn't come from a naval family. Didn't have connections. Didn't even plan to stay in the Navy long. He joined because it was a way out of a neighborhood where talent went unnoticed and potential was something people talked about but never invested in. From day one, he listened more than he spoke. While others memorized procedures, he asked why. While others followed checklists, he traced systems back to first principles. While others slept, he stayed in the engine room, hands black with grease, learning how metal felt when it was right and when it wasn't. He had a gift most engineers don't. He could hear problems before instruments detected them, feel imbalance before alarms triggered, understand machines like living systems, not diagrams. That's why he was selected, quietly, for a classified Navy engineering program. No headlines. No medals. Just work. They were building something new back then. An engine unlike anything in service. Faster, more efficient, but dangerously complex. The kind of system that looked perfect on paper and terrifying in reality. Most recruits washed out. He didn't. Not because he followed instructions better, but because he understood when to bend them. He became the one senior engineers asked questions off the record. The one who fixed things before failures were logged. The one whose solutions were used, but whose name never made the report. And he noticed something early. The Navy wanted brilliance, but only when it looked familiar. When he spoke up in meetings, his ideas were interesting. When someone else repeated them later, they were innovative. He learned to stop correcting people, to just work. When the engine finally entered service, his fingerprints were everywhere, in redundancies, in fail-safes, in hidden recovery paths that only made sense if you truly understood the system. Those recovery paths? They weren't in the public documentation. Not because they were secret, but because leadership thought they were unnecessary. Too complex. Too situational. Too dependent on intuition. Eventually, budgets shifted. Programs closed. Younger faces replaced experienced ones. The Navy moved on. He didn't. He retired quietly. No ceremony. No public recognition. Just a box of personal tools and a handshake that lasted half a second too long. Civilian life came next. Teaching part-time. Consulting anonymously. Fixing machines people said were beyond repair. And every time, it was the same story. Experts knew the rules. He knew the system. So when the Admiral asked for someone who trained the designers, his name surfaced, buried under years of forgotten memos and outdated personnel files. Not because he was famous. Because he was necessary. That's why, standing in the engine room decades later, he didn't panic. He had seen this failure before. He had warned about it. And he had designed a way out, just in case someone ever needed it. This wasn't luck. This wasn't a miracle. This was the long arc of quiet competence finally being allowed back into the room. And for the first time since his service ended, someone with real authority didn't question his presence. They trusted him. Which made what came next feel less like a repair, and more like overdue justice. The engine was running again. Power stable. Readings nominal. Systems green across the board. But relief didn't arrive the way it should have. Instead, the room filled with something colder. Doubt. The senior engineers gathered around their consoles, scrolling through data that contradicted everything they had insisted on just hours earlier. Numbers don't lie, but pride has a way of pretending they do. One of them finally spoke. Sir, with respect, this isn't a long-term solution. The Admiral didn't look away from the display. Define long-term. The engineer cleared his throat. What was done here bypasses established procedure. It's not in the approved documentation. If something fails later. The veteran cut in gently. It won't. The room stilled. The engineer turned toward him, irritation barely hidden. You can't guarantee that. The veteran nodded once. You're right, he said. I can't guarantee anything. But I can tell you exactly what will fail next, and when, if you restart it the way you planned. Silence again. Another engineer crossed his arms. With all due respect, sir, he said to the Admiral, this system was upgraded 3 times after his program ended. The emphasis was deliberate. Ended. The veteran didn't react. Instead, he walked to a panel near the rear bulkhead, one everyone else had ignored, and tapped it twice. "You updated the software," he said. "Not the physics." The Admiral raised an eyebrow. "Explain." "The engine's thermal load profile changed," the veteran said. "But the structural resonance didn't. You compensated digitally for a mechanical problem." A younger engineer scoffed. "That's not how the system works." The veteran met his eyes. "That's how it fails." The tension sharpened. This wasn't about the engine anymore. This was about who was allowed to be right. One engineer pulled up a maintenance log. "There's no record of this failure mode ever occurring." The veteran nodded. "Because every time it started to happen, I stopped it before it became a record." That line landed harder than any insult. The Admiral stepped closer. "Are you saying this ship was designed to rely on people like you?" The veteran thought for a moment. "No, sir," he said carefully. "It was designed by people like me, and then handed over to people who assumed the work was finished." A senior contractor exhaled sharply. "So what, we're supposed to throw out decades of procedure?" The veteran shook his head. "No. You're supposed to know when procedure is a map, not the terrain." The Admiral let the words hang. Then he asked the question that shifted the balance of power. "If we restart from cold again," he said, "what happens?" The veteran answered without hesitation. "Within 6 hours, you'll see microfracturing along the secondary chamber mount. It won't trigger alarms. It will look stable. And then you'll lose the engine permanently." One engineer laughed, sharp, defensive. "That's speculation." The veteran walked over to a monitor, adjusted a filter, and overlaid 2 data sets. "Then explain why this curve bends exactly where I said it would." No one spoke. The Admiral folded his arms. "Can it be prevented?" "Yes, sir." "How?" The veteran pointed to the same panel he had touched earlier. "You let the engine breathe the way it was designed to. Not the way the manual simplified it." The room shifted again, this time not with resistance, but with unease. Because they realized something dangerous. They hadn't just missed a detail. They had misunderstood the system entirely. And the man they had almost dismissed? He was the only one who knew how close they had come to losing the ship. The Admiral straightened. "Proceed under his guidance," he said. That was the moment. Not when the engine restarted. Not when the alarms went green. But when authority finally aligned with competence. And for the experts who had doubted him, this was only the beginning of their discomfort. The Admiral's order changed the room instantly. No more debate. No more theories. Now every action mattered. The veteran stood at the center of the engine room, not as a guest, but as the only person who truly understood what they were dealing with. "This isn't a software problem," he said, voice steady. "It never was." He pulled up a schematic most of the engineers had only seen in fragments. Layers appeared on the display, mechanical, thermal, structural, stacked like truth, finally aligning. "The flaw lives here," he continued, highlighting a narrow ring between 2 massive chambers. "It's not a defect. It's a compromise." The engineers leaned in despite themselves. "When the engine was first designed," the veteran explained, "we needed power density without catastrophic failure. So we built in a relief pathway, a place for stress to go instead of tearing the system apart." A senior engineer frowned. "There's no reference to a relief pathway in the manual." The veteran nodded. "Because it was never meant to be used routinely." He zoomed in further. "This ring is designed to flex, microns at a time. When the engine is under asymmetric load, it absorbs the imbalance. But only if the surrounding chamber is allowed to expand naturally." The room was silent. "You locked it down," he said, not accusing, just stating fact. "Digitally. You stabilized output by restricting movement." One engineer swallowed. "That was to increase efficiency." "And it did," the veteran agreed. "At the cost of resilience." He switched the view to live data from the running engine. "Right now, the system is stable because we restarted it backwards, from thermal equilibrium inward. That gave the relief ring time to settle." The Admiral's eyes narrowed. What happens if it doesn't? The veteran didn't sugarcoat it. The stress has nowhere to go. It fractures the mount, cascades into the secondary chamber, and you lose containment. A pause. Worst case? The veteran met his gaze. Total engine loss. Best case? You limp home with a ship that never fully trusts its own power again. That landed. A younger engineer spoke up. But why didn't our diagnostics catch this? The veteran exhaled slowly. Because you taught them not to. He pulled up a decades-old design note, flagged but never integrated. We warned that automated systems would treat this flex as noise. So we filtered it out. The realization spread across the room. They hadn't ignored a signal. They had erased it. The veteran turned to the Admiral. There's one more thing. The Admiral nodded. The relief ring wasn't just structural, the veteran said. It was procedural. It required a human decision during restart. Someone had to listen, to feel, to know when to let it move. A senior contractor stiffened. That's not acceptable in modern systems. The veteran didn't argue. No, he said. It's inconvenient. He tapped the screen again. And that's why it was phased out. The ship shuddered slightly, not failure, but adjustment. Like a muscle stretching after being locked too long. Readings fluctuated, then stabilized lower than before. Efficiency dropped 2%, an engineer reported. The veteran smiled faintly. And lifespan increased tenfold. The Admiral didn't hesitate. Lock this configuration in. Yes, sir. The veteran stepped back for the first time. What you're seeing now, he said, is the engine operating the way it was always meant to, not perfect, but honest. The room felt heavier. Not with fear, with understanding. They had chased optimization. He had protected survival. And the difference between those two philosophies had nearly cost them the ship. The Admiral looked at the veteran. How many systems like this are still out there? The veteran's expression darkened. More than you'd like, sir. And with that answer, the stakes expanded beyond this ship. Because this wasn't an isolated flaw. It was a pattern. And fixing it would require more than one forgotten veteran. It would require admitting that the past still had something to teach them. They didn't get time to celebrate. They never do. A sharp tone cut through the engine room, not an alarm, but a priority alert routed straight from the bridge. Unknown contact. The voice crackled. Range closing. The Admiral didn't look away from the veteran. How much power do you need? He asked. The veteran answered immediately. All of it. The implication was clear. Whatever he had changed, whatever fragile balance now held the engine together, was about to be tested under real stress. Not in a lab. Not in simulation. But at sea. The bridge requested propulsion readiness. Full maneuver capability. No margins. No excuses. Engineers exchanged glances. This wasn't what they planned. The configuration hadn't been stress-tested. Procedures weren't updated. Manuals weren't rewritten. But the ocean doesn't wait for paperwork. The veteran stepped back to the console. Bring it up gradually, he said. Not by percentage. By feel. A pause. The Admiral nodded. Do it. Power increased. The ship responded, slow at first, then confident. The hum deepened. The relief ring flexed exactly as designed, invisible to sensors but unmistakable to the veteran's trained eye. Hold it there, he said. The bridge confirmed speed increase. Steering regained full authority. Then the external threat escalated. Contact accelerating. The Admiral's voice was calm, but the bridge was tense. We need flank speed. That was the moment. Flank speed meant sustained maximum output, the exact condition that had broken the engine before. One engineer whispered. Sir? The Admiral raised a hand. All eyes went to the veteran. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, not in prayer, but in concentration. Not yet, he said. If you push now, you'll fight the system. The contact closed further. Seconds stretched. Then the veteran spoke again. Now. The throttle advanced. The engine didn't scream. It settled. Vibration smoothed. Temperature curves flattened. Stress redistributed instead of spiking. Readings that should have redlined, didn't. Flank speed achieved. The bridge reported. A beat. Then another. The engine held. The Admiral exhaled slowly. The contact altered course. Threat disengaging, came the report. Only then did the room allow itself to breathe. But the test wasn't over. Sustained output mattered more than peak. Minutes passed. The veteran monitored micro-fluctuations no system flagged. Adjusted by fractions. Listened to a machine that finally trusted its operators again. After 30 minutes, an engineer spoke, quieter now. Structural integrity stable. No fracture propagation. Another added. Thermal load within acceptable variance. The veteran nodded. Because you let it move. The Admiral turned to the room. Record everything, he said. Every deviation. Every result. Then he looked back at the veteran. You just took this ship from helpless to combat ready. The veteran shook his head. No, sir. I just stopped it from fighting itself. That distinction mattered. Because what saved them wasn't raw power. It was understanding. The ship cut cleanly through the water, engines steady, systems honest, no longer pretending perfection. And in that moment, every engineer in the room understood something uncomfortable. They hadn't failed because they lacked intelligence. They had failed because they stopped listening. The veteran finally stepped away from the console. The engine didn't notice. That was the proof. It no longer needed him to survive, only to be understood. The Admiral straightened his uniform. This isn't over, he said quietly. No. It wasn't. Because now the question wasn't if the engine could handle real pressure. It was how many other ships couldn't. And what the Navy would do once the truth could no longer be ignored. The engine test logs didn't stay in the engine room. They never do. Within hours, encrypted packets were moving up secure channels. Performance curves. Stress maps. Failure models rewritten in real time. What had started as a quiet emergency repair was now impossible to ignore. On a screen in a secure briefing room, red lines that once meant failure now flattened into controlled arcs. The Admiral stood at the head of the table. Around him sat people who hadn't set foot on the ship, program directors, procurement officers, senior engineers whose signatures were on every approved upgrade. They didn't look angry. They looked uncomfortable. This configuration violates 3 standing procedures, one official said carefully. The Admiral nodded. And saved $1 billion asset under live threat. Silence followed. A contractor cleared his throat. With respect, sir, the veteran's methods rely on undocumented behaviors. That creates liability. The Admiral leaned forward. No, he said evenly. Ignoring documented warnings created liability. He fixed the consequence. The room shifted. A large display lit up with an old design memo, time-stamped decades earlier. Names long retired. One name highlighted at the bottom. The veterans. This note was flagged. The Admiral continued, then deferred. The same year the recovery pathway was removed from training. No one interrupted. Every failure scenario we feared, he said, was prevented by something we chose not to teach. The weight of that settled heavily. A program director spoke up. Sir, why wasn't this engineer retained? The Admiral didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned to the veteran, seated quietly at the side of the room, not at the table. Why did you leave? He asked. The veteran considered the question. I didn't leave, he said calmly. The work did. That answer said everything. The room went quiet again. One by one, objections dissolved. Not because egos vanished, but because data doesn't negotiate. What followed wasn't applause. It was policy. Orders were issued. Training modules reinstated. Manuals revised, not simplified. Design assumptions challenged. And one final decision. The Admiral stood. As of today, he said, this veteran is reinstated as a civilian technical authority. His recommendations carry fleet-wide priority. Some people nodded. Others didn't. It didn't matter. The decision was final. After the meeting, the Admiral caught up to the veteran in the corridor. You don't owe us anything, the Admiral said. But we owe you a great deal. The veteran smiled, small, reserved. I didn't come back for recognition, he said. I came back because the system was hurting itself. The Admiral stopped. Then let us recognize you anyway. Weeks later, the changes spread. Engines ran cooler. Failures dropped. Ships stopped fighting their own design. And in a quiet ceremony with no cameras, the veteran was handed a citation. Not for brilliance. Not for genius. But for service. He accepted it with the same calm he'd shown in the engine room. Because the real victory wasn't the medal. It was knowing the system finally listened. And that the next generation wouldn't have to fight the same invisible battles. The ship sailed at dawn. Not because it had to, but because it could. Sunlight rolled across the deck as the engines came online, smooth and steady, no strain hiding behind numbers. The ocean answered with a clean wake, the kind that only comes from power used honestly. The veteran stood at the rail, hands resting lightly, feeling the rhythm beneath his feet. It wasn't louder. It wasn't faster. It was right. Around the fleet, the changes spread quietly. No headlines. No dramatic announcements. Just systems behaving better than they ever had before. Engineers noticed first. Readings made sense again. Failures stopped appearing without cause. Machines felt less like puzzles and more like partners. Training programs shifted. Manuals grew thicker, not bloated, but complete. Young sailors were taught not just what to do, but why it worked. And for the first time in years, intuition was allowed back into the room. The veteran didn't stay aboard. He never planned to. He returned to a small office near the coast, consulting when called, mentoring when asked. His name appeared in places it never had before, not on posters, but in footnotes that mattered. Design reviews now included a question that hadn't been asked in decades. What happens when the system is stressed in ways we didn't predict? That question saved ships. The Admiral watched the data roll in weeks later, improved reliability, extended service life, reduced emergency calls. Numbers told a story no one could argue with. He thought of the moment in the engine room. Not when the engine restarted, but when everyone finally stopped talking and listened. That was the real fix. The Navy didn't just recover an engine. It recovered a philosophy. That human understanding still mattered. That experience wasn't obsolete. That brilliance doesn't always arrive with the right title, or at the right time. The veteran never gave speeches. But once, during a training session, a young engineer asked him why the relief pathway wasn't automated. He smiled. Because some decisions shouldn't be made by code, he said. They should be made by people who care enough to notice. That answer stayed. Years later, when a new class of ships faced a different crisis, unfamiliar, undocumented, and urgent, they didn't panic. They remembered. They listened. And they solved it. Somewhere out at sea, a ship held together not by perfect code or flawless sensors, but by the long memory of human ingenuity. That's the part history often forgets. Not the machines we build, but the people who understand them. And when the Navy finally learned that lesson, it wasn't because of an upgrade. It was because they trusted a human. A veteran. One they should have never let go.